Hello and welcome to the fourth and final week for the HTML and CSS class. My name is Nelson and I'm going to be your instructor. So today we are going to just kind of wrap up some odds and ends. There's a lot of fun stuff that we haven't yet talked about that combine a lot of the stuff we learned in weeks 1 through 3 into allowing us to create more complex layouts. So we're going to kick off everything with talking about how we can implement CSS-only dropdowns. So drop-down menus that are implemented just in CSS without any JavaScript required. So those are really fancy. And we're going to implement actually two drop-downs, one drop-down on the menu, and then we're going to implement little pop-up menus on each one of our to-do items. Here's the final page of what I want to get to today. I know it doesn't look like much has changed between now and last week, but there's actually quite a bit. First of all, you'll notice that as I hover over these items, we get this little pop-up menu. And this is implemented entirely in CSS. Although I don't have an example here on this page, I am going to also make these menu items have their own drop-downs as well. Drop-downs are such a common thing in web design that it's really important just to sort of memorize it and get the concepts down for how to implement them. Then we are going to be talking about responsive design. What do I mean by responsive design? Well, as many of you know, a lot of people these days browse the internet or the web on tablets and phones. We want to be able to have layouts that work on any kind of device that a user might visit your web page on. Before some of the new features in CSS were made available, this was very difficult, and you would often have a desktop version of a website and a mobile version of a website. Well, I don't really like that, generally speaking now. In some circumstances, there's nothing that you can do to avoid that because the application is simply too complex. But I find for a lot of applications and pretty much any website, you can make it capable of being viewed on a tablet or a phone with very little CSS work. And I'll show you an example of that. Watch what happens as I resize this browser down. Okay, so there's my first breakpoint. You'll notice that when I get down to this size, I've decided that it's no longer appropriate to display my items in 3 columns, so I kind of flatten them out into a list like this. You'll also notice that the navigation menu jumps down underneath the header, and you'll notice that my about and my news collapse into themselves. There's another breakpoint here, so this would be something that you would see on a 7-inch tablet, is what you're looking at right now. A normal, like a 10-inch tablet, 10-inch iPad, that's going to be around, I believe, here or so. And you'll still be able to see the full application in on an iPad, but if you had an iPad mini or maybe a Nexus, you would see something like this. Then once we get even smaller, like if you're viewing this page on a phone, it would turn into something like this. And the only change that actually happened in this particular case is I replaced my navigation up here with a menu button. Now this menu button won't be functional. It won't be functional because to implement it would require some JavaScript. But you still need to know how to make it so that the menu button appears instead of the navigation bar when you get down to a certain size. So now you see that this application actually looks pretty good, even if we have a small window. So hopefully, I don't know what the frame rate is for you guys. Hopefully this demo is working for you guys, so you can see the changes. So finally, if we have time, we are going to wrap up some font with some font awesome. So we're going to get some really nice, clean icons in for our buttons here. Font Awesome is a wonderful font library, or sorry, a wonderful icon library that actually is distributed as a custom font. And its implementation is pretty awesome, and we're going to talk about how we can incorporate that into our websites to get a bunch of really nice icons that are scalable and can have colors with them. Which one didn't look too pristine? I think this looks fine. Yeah, if you're looking at a phone, you see your lists up here, your menu bar up there, and then the About page and the News. Obviously, with the phone, it's going to require a lot of vertical scrolling, but we want it so that our pages actually work. Are we supporting these sizes for Apple One users? No. Surprisingly, what we're looking at right here is roughly, what are we looking at? We're looking at, come on. So that's 500. We're looking at about 345 pixels wide. That's about where phone screens are. Phone screens are small, and yeah, some phone screens are smaller than others. And I am looking at you, iPhone 5. So, alrighty, let's start talking about dropdowns. So the page that I'm going to start off with is the page that we left with last week. So again, this page is not responsive whatsoever. It does have a variable width, which is nice, but it's not exactly, responsive. You'll also notice that it doesn't have these little pop-up pop-up menus on our buttons either, so we're going to add that in. And we also don't have any drop-downs on our menu bar. So let's implement the drop-downs on our menu bar first. So let's first talk about the markup of how we want our menu bars to look. The goal of really any web development when working in HTML is to make sure that your HTML is very clean and make it easy for yourself, either as the designer or the developer, or for other people on your team to comprehend your markup and modify it. A very common, what I'm going to show you guys is pretty much the most common pattern of making drop-down menus in CSS. And what it involves as far as the markup is concerned is that if we go take a look at our LIs, inside of our UL that's in our nav bar, if we add in another UL inside of this element, we can represent a secondary menu. So in this case, I can have the archive. I'm just going to toss out just arbitrary menu items. I'm just going to toss them out. It doesn't really matter what they are. You can name them whatever you want. So we'll have archive. I'll do a today link, a tomorrow link, a future link. Then maybe on the about, we might have another submenu that looks like li, and then toss in an a tag, give it a how about meet our team or something like that. Doesn't matter. What matters is the markup. So just to show you guys what it'll look like right now, if I hit F5, we have this. And that is obviously not ideal. We have some problems, and I'll go ahead and talk about those problems very shortly. But let me really quickly just recap here what we've done with our markup. We have simply inserted an additional UL into each one of our LIs to represent a submenu. And again, this is the most common pattern of creating dropdowns in CSS. You're going to see this everywhere. And if you use a CSS framework such as Bootstrap or Foundation, you're also going to be using markup similar to this. Now, we can make fully functional drop-down menus in CSS with literally the markup that you see right here on the screen. But you'll notice that when I hit F5, we have this problem. Everything just looks broken. And what do you think that is? Can anybody kind of figure out why we're seeing our things that are supposed to be submenus kind of eat up some of the space on our nav bar and break like this? Well, it is a matter of positioning, but it's a very important thing that you're going to have to be cognizant of whenever you start creating nested HTML hierarchies. Our selectors are currently, there we go, NATO said it. Our selectors are currently being applied to our sub navigation items because we don't have our CSS written in such a way that it only applies to immediate descendants. So let's fix that one first. So right now we see header UL. This is going to match every single UL in the header. That is not ideal. I want to select only the top level UL. And we know it's a top level UL because it's underneath the nav element, or immediately underneath the nav element. So I can come into my markup and I can say, okay, I want header nav immediate descendant UL. So that means it's only going to select the UL that is immediately inside of a nav element. So that'll make it so this style will not apply to these ULs. Then let's go through our other selectors. We have header UL LI. I'm also going to have to give it the same treatment. I want header a UL that's immediate descendant of nav, and an LI that's immediate descendant of that UL. And same here almost. I am fairly happy with the way this selector is looking, or this rule is looking, except for I don't want the border right to be applied to my A tags that are within the submenus. So I'm going to cut this property out and then write another selector that says header nav UL LI A. So that will only match the A tags that are directly within a UL that are directly with, or sorry, A tags that are directly within an LI that are directly with the UL, blah, 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 blah. So now when I come back and hit F5, it looks like I could have potentially completely messed up my stuff. Let's first go ahead and make sure that my stuff is actually being applied correctly. And again, the Chrome development tools are just incredibly important for understanding this. Actually, no, I know exactly what's going on. What's going on is our ULs are still in existence. Because our ULs are still in existence and still being displayed on the page, they're pushing my UL down. And if you recall, I used the bottom attribute. So if I were to maybe make the bottom like negative 500 pixels, or maybe that was too much. 2, 1. Here we go. So we have a problem with our ULs causing our parent UL to grow in its height. And I don't really want that to happen. So let's talk about how we can fix that. What I want to do is I want these ULs to not appear or not be displayed unless the parent LI is being hovered over. Furthermore, if they are displayed, I don't want them to affect the positioning of any other element. Do you guys recall the simplest way to make an element not affect the positioning of any other element? Right. We want to make them absolutely positioned, so it takes it out of the flow of the document. So let's do those two things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select one of the submenus. I'm going to say header nav UL UL. I'm going to say display none and position absolute. So right now I'm telling all the submenus to no longer display. And guess what we get? We get exactly what we were looking at before. So that's nice. But this obviously doesn't quite solve our problem because now our ULs are always invisible. So what we want to do is we want to write a selector that will only select a child UL if the parent LI is being hovered over. And we can do that very easy in CSS by using a pseudo selector. So let's do that. I want to say inside my nav element that's inside my header, I want to say if there's an LI that is hovered over, I want to grab his UL and I want to give his displayed block to be block. So what this is doing is saying select me out the UL that's immediately parented to an LI that is being hovered over by the mouse, and that's done with the pseudo selector hover, and pseudo selectors always have a colon right there. So if I go back to my markup, I can see, well, I want this UL to display if its parent LI is being hovered over. So if I go back to my page now, we actually see it's sort of working. Now, the first thing you'll notice is it's actually appearing behind some things. Specifically, it's appearing behind my boxes, my to-do boxes. That has to do with what's called the z-index. A z-index of an absolutely positioned element determines what order it appears in. I guess you could consider it to be the z-axis. Although we are looking at a plane, the browser window is just a plane, it's just an XY coordinates, it does have a concept of a Z coordinate as well, insofar as what the browser decides to render first. So I want to make my submenus have a higher Z index than my sections. If I look at my section Z index, I wonder if computed style will actually show it to me. I don't know if it will. Z-index auto. Okay, so the z-index is being calculated automatically. I actually don't. I haven't memorized the rules for how z-indexes get calculated automatically, because 99% of the time, if you want something to appear above something else, you should always make your z-index declaration explicit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this a z-index of 1000. And I'm giving it a z-index of 1000 specifically so that I have 999 other z-indices that I could use to make something appear behind the UL. So I typically start off with 1000. You can start off with any large number that you want, really. Now, you could certainly set the z-index to 1, but then you'll run into another situation if you want something to appear above these boxes but below the navigation. Then you only have one z-index to work with, or 0 actual values to work with. By setting it to a bigger number, it's more future-proof because now I have 999 other z-indices that I have at my disposal. Okay, so now when I hover over this, you'll see that we are now positioning actually pretty close to what we want. But we have another problem. Notice how when I hover over archive, our other A tags are being hovered over. That isn't ideal either. So let's fix that first. Let's find the rule that causes my A tag to be hovered over. Notice how it says li:hover A, which means that any A tag that appears in a li that's being hovered over will be styled this way. We can fix this problem with a simple immediate descendant selector. By doing that, only the LIs that are immediately hovered over will be selected. And you'll notice another benefit to this is that the topmost A tag will also be selected. So that's awesome. So we're getting pretty close, but we have a couple more problems. The first problem is that this LI has some default styling that the browser applies to it. You notice those little bullet points on the left-hand side of it, and you should also notice that there's a massive margin. So let's fix that next. I'm going to create another selector for my, or no, I'm going to create another selector. So here's my selector that only selects submenus. Here's my selector that only selects top-level menus. I want a selector that'll select both of them. So I want a header, nav, UL. This selector will select both top-level and submenus. And I want to take his list style, his margin, and his padding, and I want to cut it and place it into the selector that selects both top-level and sub-navigation menus. So now when I refresh, we have a drop-down. Now fortunately the defaults of where the drop-down is being positioned are absolutely perfect, in that they're positioned exactly where they need to be positioned. So if I go ahead and, just for the sake of showing you guys some stuff, let's look at this in Internet Explorer. We see the exact same behavior that we want. And then let's look at this in Firefox, which is taking an hour and a half to start up. and we can see that our dropdowns also work. Okay, so now our dropdowns are functional, but there's still a couple things I don't like about them. I don't like the widths of them, and I don't like that they don't have a drop shadow or a border. So let's make them look a little nicer. Also, that red color needs to die in a fire. I hate that red color. I'm going to go ahead and just nuke our this style that gives it the gradient. I'm just going to say background, dark gray, foreground, let's do a very light gray. Sorry, it's just really bugging me. There we go. I think that looks nice. Ooh, it looks like we have another issue. Notice how there's a border radius being applied to the first LI inside of the submenu. We don't want that to happen either. So let's find the rule that does it. It's right here. UL LI first child. How do we fix this? Well, immediate descendant selectors. So I want the UL that immediately appears within the nav and only the LI that immediately appears within that. This will select the first A tag that appears on the top level navigation and not the sub navigation. So now you see the border radius is gone out of our flyout, but it's still present in our main board or our main nav. So the next thing I want to do is I want to introduce some widths. So I'm just going to be super lazy right now and show you guys a really quick tip for using the Chrome development tools. You guys want to see this? Check this out. If you ever want to use the Chrome developer tools to help you style an element that only appears when a particular pseudo selector is present, such as active or hover or anything, check this out. I'm going to click on this LI. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to say force element state, and I'm going to say hover. Now this will keep the flyout visible so that we can style it using our tools. I'm actually not going to do this on this LI. I'm going to do this on the other LI. The reason is right now I want to figure out what's the maximum width I can give this without it going over my or without it surpassing the edge of my site. So let's do that. I'm going to click on this UL and I'm going to give him a custom element style. I'm going to start off with 250 pixels, and that looks a little bit too big, so I'm just using the down arrow key on my keyboard. Looks like 157 is about good. This isn't perfect. I want everybody to realize that what I'm doing is not perfect because the width of this contact menu is going to change depending on the font rendering of the particular browser you're using. This is only an approximation, and it's good enough for me. So I'm going to take this width that I just calculated by trial and error, and I'm going to apply it to my UL. So now when I come back, both of these menu items have a fixed width, and I think that looks a lot nicer. Let's do one more thing. I really want a border and I want a drop shadow on my menu. So let's add in the border first. On my UL, I'm going to give everything a border of 2 pixels, solid dark gray, and then I'm going to give it a border top of none. I'm going to leave the border top in there. There, that looks a lot better. A lot more legible anyway. Again, this isn't a design class. Design is all about what you're trying to go for. I'm not a web designer. But these are the tools that you would have to use in order to actually make a good design. I think a border radius on the bottom left and bottom right of this would look good. So I'm going to go ahead and add that as well. I'm going to say border bottom left radius. I like 3 pixels or 5 pixels. Anything more than that, it just looks kind of tacky. Let's see what 3 pixels looks like. It's too subtle. Let's go with 5 pixels. It's kind of chopping it off a little bit right there. I don't really like that either. I'm going to go back down to 3 pixels because it's chopping off the border a little bit and I don't like that effect. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to toss in a drop shadow. I don't think we've talked about drop shadows yet. But drop shadows are a really nice feature of CSS3 that allows us to apply drop styles to block level elements, or drop shadows to block level elements. And the way in which that you will probably spend the majority of your time writing box shadows is by going to Google and typing in CSS3 box shadow, hitting enter, and clicking on one of the generators. Let's go with this one. Yeah, I like this one. I want to have a distance of, oh, go away. Stop it. Let's give it a distance of 0. I actually want it to have a distance of, let's give it 90 degrees. Come on. Let's give it a distance of like 3, maybe. There we go. Give it a blur of 5, that's fine. The RGB, 50-50-50 is okay. Opacity. Let's bring our opacity just down a little bit. And then let's take this generated code and copy and paste it. Box shadows are actually one of the things that I have memorized, but it took me a while to memorize them, to be honest, because I didn't really use them very often. So the generators that you'll find around the internet are really, really nice to get accustomed to the syntax. So, if I refresh again, we now have a drop shadow. Actually, I think I want this drop shadow to be down a little bit in the y-axis, and that's going to be accomplished with the second parameter. The second parameter is the y offset. Let's turn this into 5 so that it doesn't overlap my header at all. Yeah, that looks okay. Maybe down to 4. And bump the opacity down to 0.4. There. Really nice subtle effect on both the rounded corners and the drop shadow. Okay, so we have another problem. Notice how an active link, if I hover over it, it changes the color of the font, but it doesn't actually change the background, so we get this awful, like, very difficult to read thing. That's because our style that is giving it the background, which is down, the one that's giving it the background has less precedence than the one that's giving it the foreground color. So let's take a look at what's giving it the foreground color. If I look at active, you'll notice that we have 2 selectors and one of them has a higher precedence. The one that has a higher precedence is actually this one. And the reason it has a higher precedence is because we have a class selector in there. Even though this one does have a few points for it because it has a pseudo selector and an immediate descendant selector, this one has higher precedence. So this one will style the background, but it won't style the color, which is not ideal. The way I'm going to resolve this for now is simply by giving it the same color that it should have, which is 0, and essentially resetting that in my active selector. And now because my active selector overrides my hover selector, it's not going to have a problem. Okay, so how's everyone feeling about our dropdowns? Alrighty. So, again, dropdowns are something that you're going to do a lot in CSS because they're everywhere. Somebody asked about the organization of my CSS document because you saw that I had to actually search to get the appropriate selector. The answer is that I usually, not only do I split up my CSS into multiple files, I also use a preprocessor called less, and that's what I'm used to using. But because we're only working with one style sheet and we're not working with any preprocessors, then it's going to be a little bit frustrating. So I guess at this point all I can say is there are solutions to CSS organization, and they are out there, and they're easy to practice and easy to learn, but we're not too worried about that right now, because the most important thing is getting our page to function. Alrighty, so we have our dropdowns, which is nice. Now let's go ahead and implement our pop-ups. So if you guys recall from our other example that's in a Chrome window that flew away somewhere, here you are. Our little items have these little pop-up menus that come up and allow us to select Finish, Edit, or Delete. They use pretty much the exact same concepts that we have been already discussing. So let's go ahead and implement those. The first step is always going to be to build your markup. Now remember, CSS isn't going to allow us to create something out of nothing, if that makes sense. Our elements have to exist within our HTML document to style them. And unfortunately, it's going to become a little repetitive what I'm about to show you guys, but it's going to follow a very similar pattern to what we saw up here with our dropdowns. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add another UL to each one of my items that aren't already finished, and I'm going to give it a class of flyout or something. Then I'm going to add in some LIs with the individual buttons. So we have a finish button, we have a finish button, we have an edit button, and we have a delete button. So we have these three buttons, and they're in this little UL. I'm going to just take this UL and I'm going to copy and paste it to all my other items that I want my flyout to appear on. Obviously, if you were, if this was database driven, you would only have to do this once. But because it's not, we have to do it for every single item. So yeah, I get that that's kind of annoying. Okay, so now we have our markup implemented. And if I come back to my page and refresh it, and I lost it again. Are you it? No, you aren't. Are you it? No, you aren't. Where did you go? You're it. There we go. Now if I refresh, we see obviously something that isn't desirable. So at this point, what we need to do is give our ULs that have the class of flyout the same treatment that we gave our drop-down menus in our navigation bar. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go down all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to write a selector that'll select out my flyouts from my to-do lists. Now you'll notice that each three of these sections are parented to a to-do container, or no, more specifically, they're selected to a to-do list. So what I want to do is I want to write a selector in terms of the to-do list. Remember, I don't want my selectors to be too specific so that they can't easily be used for other elements, but I don't want them to be too general so that they override elements that I don't want them to do, or don't want them to override. So let's go ahead and grab our to-do list class and do a .flyout. So this will select any element that is a flyout underneath the to-do list. Let's give it the same treatment. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say list style is none, margin is 0, and padding is 0. By the way, quick side note, the units for numbers in CSS are always required unless the value is 0. So I could have just written it like that, and you'll see it written like that fairly often. I'll leave it like that because that's technically probably the way you should do it, but my fingers automatically go to the PX keys. But yes, you can, if the value is 0, you don't need a unit. If it's not 0, you do need a unit. Anyway, so let's give it the list style of none, margin, padding of 0. So now if I come back to my document and refresh, it's starting to look a lot better. So that's good. So next up, I'm going to give my flyouts a width. I'm going to give them a width of, I don't know, 150 sounds good. Is 150 good? I'm not even going to be able to see this represented yet, am I? And 150 is way too big. Let's do 75. Let's give my flyout a background of dark gray. Then let's give my A tags inside of my flyout a background of, or a color of a very light gray. Let's see how this looks. Okay, so that's closer. Next up, I want to get rid of that border, and I want to get rid of my underlines. So to do that, I have to style the A tags. So I'm going to give my A tags a text decoration of none to get rid of the underlines, and I'm going to give them a border of none to get rid of the borders. Which I think the borders actually might be yeah, they're applied through the LIs themselves. So what I actually have to do is I have to write to-do list flyout LI and say border of none. Refresh, and hey look, we have our menu. But it's still not positioned correctly, so let's get them positioned right. I'm going to give it my flyouts a position of absolute, a right of 0, and a top of 0. And this is not going to do what you want it to do. Notice how, or wait a sec, it does. Ooh, that's right. I already have position relative applied to my LIs because I positioned my finish button. Yeah, there's my position relative. If I didn't have my position relative on my parent LIs, notice how everything flies over to the top right. Yeah, so stuff and things. Okay, so we've positioned our flyout menu, we've styled our flyout menu, but it still doesn't appear when we hover over our LIs. So let's fix that next. I'm going to give my flyout a display of none by default. Then I'm going to say to-do list li hover flyout display block. So if we're hovering over the li, then make its flyout display. And look at that. We now have a flyout. Except we now have a positioning problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my flyout a z-index of 999. And that fixes that problem. Finally, we don't have a hover style for either my parent LIs that I'm hovering over, and we also don't have a hover style for my flyout itself. So let's fix both of those problems. I believe what I did in the original example, yeah, okay. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go into my LI, find my LI has this, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to say LI hover. I'm going to give it a background of dark gray and a color of, how about pure white? That might look good. That almost works, and it works for even my flyout too, which is really cool. But notice how it doesn't work for my my items that are marked as finished. So what I need to do is I need my background and my background to take precedence over this style right here. To do that, all I gotta do is make it, I have two options. I can either mark this property as important. By marking this property as important, what I'm saying is that this property will override every other property, no matter the precedence of the rules that matched it. However, I don't like using important very often. Important will make... If you think that right now this background needs to be applied under every single case, you are wrong. Because if you're developing this application 2 weeks later, you're going to find a situation where you have a important property that you want to apply everywhere. And then 2 weeks later, you'll need an important property, and so on and so on. And there's no way in CSS to define the precedence of importance. They're actually defined in order that they appear within the style sheet. So another way to do this is, instead of just guessing how many additional element selectors I have to add on to this selector to have it have a higher precedence than this selector, I'm going to use a comma and say to-do list dot finish hover, which this will have a higher precedence than this selector because it has a hover. Or not. To-do list finish hover, li finish hover. Whoops. I slightly misspoke on that. What? Stop this madness. To-do list li important. Oh. How did you guys let me type in finish? And, wow. I'm not styling the finish, I'm styling the important. Derp. Okay. There we go. Alrighty, so now we have all of our LIs properly being styled when we hover over them. And we also have a little pop-up menu that allows us to click on any one of these actions. I'm actually going to go ahead and make our pop flyout menu a little bit larger. I want to make it 100 pixels. And there we go. The last thing I want to do is I want to style my finish button, or actually I have two more things I want to do. First of all, I want these flyout menus to be centered as far as their text. To do that, I'm going to find the flyout LI and I'm going to say text align center, which will center my text. The final thing I want to do is I want to give my finish button a special style. So to do that, I am going to write a selector that'll select out the first item or the first LI inside of my flyout, and I want to give it a special style and a special rollover style. So that introduces us to another pseudo selector we can use. I can say to-do list flyout li first child, and then I can go ahead, I want to give it a background of black. Then, if the first child is hovered over, I want to give it a background of red. So that really cleans up our little flyout right there, makes it a little nicer to look at. Okay, so how's everyone doing? Alright, let's toss some more border shadows into it, because you know what? Everybody loves border shadows, or box shadows. I'm going to find my box shadow definition up here, and I'm going to apply it to my flyout, and I'm also going to apply it to my LI that's hovered over, which will give us an effect like this, which is just a really cheap little effect that can be tacky if used in excess, but I like it if it's subtle. Which this could be a little bit too subtle. Maybe I should bring up my opacity to maybe 0.7. There we go, that looks good. I think the last thing that's bothering me is that border. I don't want that border to be there when I hover over. I like the border being there when I'm not hovered over, but I don't want it to be there when I'm hovered over. So I'm going to show you guys something that is actually really important when dealing with removing borders. So I'm going to find my selector that selects out my LIs of my to-do list if they're hovered over, which is right here. And I'm going to give it a border of none. But what problem do you think that giving a LI a border of none when it's hovered over will cause? Think about the box model. Think about how the height of something is calculated and the width of something is calculated. Right, by doing this, it's actually going to jump my items a little bit. In fact, if I try hard enough, I bet I can get my mouse cursor right into a point where it'll flip between both of them. No, I can't quite do it. Anyway, so first of all, I shouldn't have said border none. I should have said border bottom none because I'm killing that pretty little green border. But the point is that you can barely see it, but every time I move over one of these LIs, my LIs actually decrease in height by 1. The way I'm going to fix this is instead of setting it a border to none, this is a very common technique in CSS when dealing with borders. Oh, come on. Come on, please. Please. There you are. This is a very common technique of working with CSS. I'm going to set his border bottom to the same color as his background. So 1px solid 444, so that the user won't even realize there's a border there. But the benefit of this is it won't change the height of my element. So now you see that the borders are no longer being applied when I'm hovering over. Although technically they are being applied, they're just being masked because they are being set to the same color as the background. So that's a very, very common technique of dealing with that problem. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different things, important things. I know that we haven't necessarily I haven't really introduced anything quite new except for the hover pseudo selector, but I hope what you guys are taking away from this is that yes, CSS is very simple because it's a very simple language to learn as far as the language itself goes. There's not a whole lot of things you have to learn. I mean, you have to learn the syntax for selectors and the syntax for properties, but that's about it. But CSS gets very complicated when you try to use it to accomplish goals. And at that point, it's just a matter of just learning the individual techniques that a person or that you would need to use in order to accomplish your design. So that's the difficult part with CSS. And so what I wanted to do is combine everything we've talked about so far and show some very common examples of layouts that you might be asked to implement if you are a web developer or a web designer. So I hope this goes over some of the more common techniques that people would run across when working with CSS. The hover element or hover pseudo selector is awesome, but it gets very confusing. Remember, the Chrome developer tools are your friend. They are going to tell you who is parented by what, and they're very important to learn. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at after break is we're going to be making our web page more responsive, or we're going to make it responsive. And again, responsive design is actually a very recent thing to have happened to the web development community. The media selectors or media queries that we're about to use are really only implemented by the latest browsers. I don't think IE8 even supports what we're going to use, if I'm not mistaken. So this should be lots of fun. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and go on break. And we're back. So let's go ahead and get some responsive action going here. What I mean by responsive web design is, again, just to recap what I said earlier, is it's a technique for allowing our web pages to scale appropriate to the width of the browser window. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to create layouts that will work on everything from a mobile device to a desktop computer. So let's go ahead and talk about that. The first thing that I have to do to my markup, however, and I'm going to do this first, even though it won't actually affect how it renders in Chrome, but it will affect how it's rendered by mobile web browsers. I'm going to add a meta tag in my head element, and this meta tag that I'm about to add is very important because if you don't add it, then the browsers on mobile devices won't actually respond appropriately to responsive design. The reason we have to add this is because obviously mobile web browsers were a thing they became a thing a good while after HTML and CSS were invented. So we actually have to instruct our mobile web browsers that we want them to behave in a way that will allow us to style our web pages depending on the size of the viewport. So I'm going to go ahead and add a meta tag, and I'm going to give it the name of viewport. Then I'm going to give it the content of. Now this is important. First of all, I want to say initial scale equals 1. So that means I want the initial scale of the web page to be 1. And then I'm going to separate each one of these properties with commas. Then I want to say maximum scale equals 1. And then I want to say the most important one is width equals device width. The width equals device width is the most important one. What that's going to do is that's going to cause the width of the page to always be the width of the viewport in the mobile browser, unless there's a CSS rule that makes it impossible to do that. Without the width equals device width, then our responsive web design will not work on mobile web browsers. Then the other two are important because I want to say the initial scale equals 1, the maximum scale equals 1. That's going to prevent people from zooming in and potentially breaking our layouts. Whether or not you want an initial scale and maximum scale is entirely dependent on the application you're writing and the constraints within your CSS itself. I would recommend these properties for a majority of cases because they just make things a lot easier to reason about because you don't have to worry about users messing up the scale of your application. I also want to point out that there is a slight problem with iOS in that when you rotate the orientation of an iOS device, the actual scale of the web page won't change properly. I encourage people to go out and look for a solution to this themselves simply because it's a little hack that involves some JavaScript and it's annoying and obnoxious, and I don't want to get into it right now. I just want to point it out that if you guys notice on iPads or iPhones, when you rotate the device, it actually zooms in the page instead of giving it more width, then the problem is actually an iOS specific feature, and I'm finger quoting right now, that causes that behavior. But this is all we need for now. And these definitions aren't actually going to change the way our page is rendered on the browser or on a desktop browser. This meta tag is specifically for mobile browsers that will simply allow them to take advantage of the features we're about to use. So, how do we make responsive web design? It's really only a matter of one concept, and that concept is called a media query. Now, in early versions of CSS, there was such a thing as a media query, but it was limited. In early versions of CSS, you had media queries that allowed you to give your web browser a particular style and then give a print version of your website a completely different style. But since very recently that definition has changed, and media queries now allow us to specify conditional rules that will only be applied if a particular criteria is met. And the criteria can be anything from the orientation of the device to the width of the device. The main ones we're going to be focusing on is the min width and the max width. So let's solve our first problem. Right now, on my page, I have a min width and a max width of 900 and a min width of 600. I'm going to get rid of this min width entirely. I'm just going to delete it, save out my style sheet, go back to my browser and refresh. Now I can make this browser window as small as I want, but look at that. That is not ideal. When we make it so small, our page breaks. It just dies. So let's create our first breakpoint. A breakpoint is a terminology that simply means the first bit of or the first time that our layout will change depending on the screen width. What I want to do is I want to create a breakpoint that when our browser window becomes smaller than 600 pixels, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, I want to make my navigation bar appear underneath my header. Second, I want my two-column layout down here to turn into a one-column layout. And third, I want my three-column layout right here to turn into a one-column layout. So let's do the navigation first. I'm going to, first of all, show you guys the syntax for a media query. So do @media, and then in parentheses specify your query. In this case, I'm going to create a query of a max width of 600 pixels. Then I'm going to open up curly braces. Any CSS rule that I put in between these two curly braces will only be applied to the page will only be applied to the page if the browser window is less than 600 pixels. Okay, so now that we got the syntax of the media query out of the way, let's jump back into the browser and let's play around with our Chrome development tools and get things to look the way I want them to. I already know exactly what rules I want to apply, but I want to show people the process of using the Chrome development tools to modify the page to get a better idea about how you want to write your markup. So the first thing I'm going to do is currently my H1 is not floated, so that's good. But my UL has a position of absolute. What happens if I take off that position of absolute? Well, quite a few things break. If I take off the position of absolute, notice how our menu bar does indeed go down to the bottom of the page, or to below the header, but we have a problem. And that problem is, you guys remember the zero height problem with floats from last week? Remember that our UL, although it's being positioned statically, our LIs are being floated to the left. And because the nav element only has elements that are floated, it has a height of 0, unless I give it a couple of properties. So let's go through the properties I would need to give it. Let's try overflow hidden. That's the simplest one. Hey look, overflow hidden fixes the problem. But watch what happens when I try to use my my dropdowns do work for whatever reason. You know what I think it is? Darn it, it works. I know, I hate it so much. Why does it work? It shouldn't work. Hidden. And then position is no longer absolute, and we still get our elements being positioned appropriately. The absolute position of my submenu. No, absolute positions should actually, because technically they're children of my nav, they should technically... Oh, you know what it is? No, it's not that either. Look at me fail. Either way, that's not important right now. Although I do kind of want to figure this out. Let's see here. Absolutely positioned elements shouldn't actually appear if they're parented within an element that has overflow hidden applied. Let's try this in Internet Explorer, because maybe there's just something weird going on. And if it doesn't work here, then I'll just accept the fact that I'm a horrible person and completely messed up. Okay, so I'm going to use my my Internet Explorer development tools, and I'm going to click on my UL. I'm going to remove his position absolute. Then I'm going to go jump up to my nav, and I'm going to give it a style of overflow hidden. And it works in IE2. Wonderful. at least consistently embarrassing me, as opposed to having problems. Either way, Nelson fails when things work. They do actually. They do when you're stuck in a situation where things are just awful. Actually, give me one position absolute. Whatever. It works. Can't argue with that. Oh darn, things just keep on working. I guess it is good to be bad at breaking things, I suppose. But that's not the point here. The point here is I still wouldn't use overflow hidden. In this particular case, I would toss a clear fix on it. So let's do that first. So I want to apply a media query that will stop being applied when the browser window is 600 pixels wide. So there's a few ways there's something very important about what I'm about to do. The first thing, I want to style this position absolute on my UL. I want to give it a position of static. But can anybody tell me why this actually won't work? And yes, it doesn't actually work. Thank you so much. Okay, so I just applied a media query, and the media query says that if the browser window is smaller than 600 pixels, I want to give my navigation a position of static. This is a problem that you're going to run into when working with responsive web design. Notice how nothing happens when I get smaller than 600 pixels? Can anybody tell me why? The reason I'm focusing on this is because this is something that's going to annoy you when working with, or annoy you very much when working with responsive web design, because what you always have to be aware of is what Exxon said, precedence. This rule follows the same precedence rules as if it did not appear within a media query. Meaning if I want to override a property on another element that's already being styled in a particular way, I have to make this selector have higher precedence. The way I always do this with responsive web design is I always just prefix it with an HTML element selector. That'll knock its order of precedence up by 1. And by knocking its order of precedence up by 1, we get the desired result. Now, of course, it still doesn't work because we need a clear fix, but we now see that as I get smaller than 600 pixels wide, our position does change to static. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to conditionally apply a clear fix. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy the selector, add in the after pseudo element, and copy and paste my clear fix code into here. Now that I've applied the clear fix to my navigation, it now makes the header smaller. Or larger, sorry. And if you're sitting here wondering, Nelson, do you really manually apply the clear fix to every single element that you want to by just copy and paste the CSS? And the answer is no. I would use something like less mixins, but we don't have mixins in normal CSS. Okay, so we fixed this. Let's go ahead and add some more properties in here. I'm not going to really explain them too much, just to make our code a little bit pretty, or our page a little bit prettier. I'm going to give it the UL a margin of 0px up and down and 10px left and right. Then I'm going to give it a background. I'm going to give it the same background that I use for my LI or my A tags, which is what background did I use for these guys? They look like D. Yep. on DDD. So I'm going to give this a background of DDD. That should make our navigation bar look a little bit nicer, and it does. Next up, I am going to go ahead and make my UL, my parent UL, have a top left border radius and a top right border radius. Give it a nice little cheap, tacky effect. Top right border radius 3px, top left border radius 3px. Come back here, refresh, and we now have a nice little border radius. So there's the first step of our responsive menu. Let's go ahead and fix our sections now. So again, it's very common to, when testing stuff like this out and making something responsive, use the development tools. Figure out what properties you need to override in order to make it work the way you want it to. I actually already know what I have to do. I need to get rid of the float left, and I need to get rid of the width. By getting rid of the float left and the width, it now looks the way I want it to if the browser is smaller than 600 pixels. So let's make that happen. I'm going to take this selector right here, I'm going to click on it, which will actually allow me to highlight the text and hit Control-C to copy it. I'm going to jump back into my media query, and I'm going to say HTML to-do container section. I'm going to give a float of none and a width of auto. By doing that, our to-do list now properly gets smaller. I'm not a big fan right now of these massive margins in between my to-do lists. So let's look at that. I want to find out where this margin is coming from. I already know where the margin is coming from, but for sake of demonstration, notice how when I hover over my section, we see that as a margin and a padding. I want to get rid of his margin top. And I also want to tone down his padding to maybe 5 pixels. Okay, so I want to set the margin top to 0 and set his padding to 5 pixels. There we go. I like the way that's looking. The last thing I need to do is I need to collapse my two sections right here. And again, just to show you guys the process over and over and over again, because you will be using this process over and over and over again, I'm going to jump into my Chrome development tools. I'm going to say, okay, you need to get rid of your width and your float, and news needs to get rid of his margin right. So let's do that. I'm going to write a selector that's going to select out both these sections. So I'm going to select on site info container. So I'm going to say HTML site info container section, and I'm going to say float none, width auto, and I'll give it a padding of 5 pixels, which will make it look kind of nicer. And it looks like I forgot to reset the right-hand margin of my news, so I'm going to go ahead and just reset both their margins to 0 pixels. And there we go. We now have our first breakpoint. So how's everyone feeling about our first breakpoint? So let's do our second one. The second one is going to be for phones. I'm going to target, how about probably around 370 pixels, I think is what I came up with. So let's go ahead and write another breakpoint that'll only apply when our size is smaller than 370 pixels. So to do that, I'm going to add another media query, and I'm going to say media max width is 370 pixels. So what do I want to happen on this breakpoint? Well, I want this entire navigation bar to disappear and get replaced with a menu button. Now we're not going to be talking about actually making the menu button functional because that would require JavaScript, but we will talk about how we can conditionally show and hide it. So let's go ahead and see how we would do that. I'm going to add a nav element with a class of mobile, and inside of it I'm going to give it a single A tag called menu. If I come back to the page and hit refresh, now we have this really ugly menu link appearing no matter what the size of my window is. So I want by default this menu link to not appear. So how do I do that? Well, I got to select out my nav and set its display to none. So I'm going to say header nav.mobile display none. Come back here, and now it is hidden. But now I want my mobile navigation to appear if my width is smaller than 370 pixels. So I'll copy this selector, prefix it with an HTML element selector to give it higher precedence, and then set its display back to block. So now you notice when I get down to 370 pixels, our menu button does appear. But I want the other navigation bar to disappear when our mobile navigation does appear. So to do that, I'm going to use a selector that we haven't actually talked about yet. This is a new CSS3 selector. It's going to be HTML header nav not mobile. So what this selector does is it'll select everything that this selector does except for elements that have the mobile class attached to it. Which means, by refreshing the page, notice how my main navigation disappears and it seems like it just gets replaced by my menu button. But in reality, we know that that's not actually happening. What's happening is our menu bar is being made to be hidden and our mobile menu bar is being made to be shown. Okay, so let's wrap this up with some basic styles for our menu bar, or our mobile navigation button. Let's say header nav mobile A. I'm going to give it display block. Remember, A tags are inline elements by default. Then I'm going to just style it as a button, and obviously you could style it to whatever you wanted to. I do actually have some styles in mind that I want to apply to it. Let's give it a color of a light gray. Let's give it a padding of 7 pixels up and down and 15 pixels left and right. Let's give it a background of dark gray, a border of slightly darker gray, which gives it a really subtle effect, a text decoration of none to get rid of the underline, a margin of 5, and let's get a font size of 10 points. So we have a really subtle, I don't know if you guys can even see the subtle border. It makes it look kind of fuzzy. I always like that kind of effect when you mix the grays with really, really subtle differences. But now what we have here is an example of an application that has been made to be responsive so that it'll look the way we want it to on tablets, mobile phones, and desktops. Or even netbooks. I mean, netbooks have smaller screens too, so you might want to set a breakpoint for netbooks if you have a particular layout that seems to be just too horizontally intensive. Okay, and then just to recap, other than responsive design, the one thing I did introduce is the not pseudo selector, which is very handy. Again, the not pseudo selector just filters out things that are matched by the selector you pass into it. Okay, so is everyone doing good? I know it seems like some basic stuff, and that's exactly what that's pretty much what this class has turned into at this point, which is why I want to instead focus on doing stuff like this in shorter videos that are more targeted, because again, just there isn't a lot of stuff with CSS. We've seen an example of every single bit of CSS syntax that we can throw at it. And when I say syntax, I don't mean the specific pseudo selectors, because we haven't talked about all the pseudo selectors. But we've seen examples of selectors, we've seen examples of rules, we've seen examples of properties, and any web design that you look at today is just going to be a combination of those things. At this point, it's just a matter of learning the specific techniques and specific properties that allow you to position your page the way you want it to. But I think that this particular demo application actually gives us a lot of fun stuff to play with, a lot of stuff that you will encounter on a day-to-day basis when working with CSS. We have examples of pop-up menus, drop-down menus. We have examples of navigation tabs to the right-hand side. We have examples of some gradients, of a 2-column layout, a 3-column flexible layout. We have examples of responsiveness, both with 2 breakpoints, one being this breakpoint and the other one being this breakpoint. So yeah, I mean, stuff and things. Question, where is the max width call coming from? I assume the browser understands this rule and checks to see if the value is reached. Yeah, the max width is something that's built into media queries, and it's something that the browser itself understands. And when the browser sees a media query, it'll only apply that style to that, or only apply the styles within the media query if it's at that particular size. This isn't something that's coming from JavaScript or HTML or anything that's advanced at all. This is something that's coming directly from the browser because it understands the syntax. There's one more thing about responsive design that you guys need to be aware of. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say when we hit the 200 or when we hit the 600, I want to make the background red. And then when we hit the 370, I want to make the background blue. Actually, this might work. It might not. Yeah, unfortunately, it's... hold on, let me swap the order of these two guys. And I'll show you guys the problem. Okay, so when we get to here, we get red. Yeah, there we go. The problem is that I had 2 selectors that had the same precedence, so I had to swap the order of them to make my example work the way I wanted to. So something you might run into with responsive web design when you make breakpoints is that, look at this. When I get down to 600 pixels, the background turns red. But then when I get down to 300 pixels, the background is still red. So what's going on here? If we look at our media queries, we'll see that these queries or these rules are always going to be applied if the browser window is smaller than 600 pixels, and these rules are always going to be applied when the browser is smaller than 370 pixels. Now, because 370 pixels is less than 600 pixels, we run into a situation where we might have conflicting rules inside of our media queries. In this particular example, that behavior was desirable because think about what I was doing as like building up. You know, when I hit 600 pixels, I stripped a few things, and then when I hit 370 pixels, I stripped a few other things. So I kind of like built up to where I wanted to be with the mobile layout. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes you want a media query to not affect any breakpoint that is smaller than the one you're currently looking at. In this example, I want the background of the page to be red when I'm at 600 pixels, and I want it to be blue when I'm at 370 pixels. Now I know what you guys are thinking right now. Well, can't I just say blue important? Oh, that'll work. Can I just make this style have more weight to it? Yeah, I probably could do that, couldn't I? That should work. Nope, it doesn't. Either way, the point is that neither of these solutions would be desirable. What I really want to do is I only want to turn the background red if it's between 370 pixels and 600 pixels. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to toss in another media query. I'm going to say max width is 600 pixels and min width is 370 pixels. And then I'm going to move my rule that changes the background to red into that one. So now when I get down to 600 pixels, it's red, but when I get down to 370 pixels, this media query no longer gets executed because I've set both the max width and the min width. So how does everyone feel about combining media queries? Alrighty, so those are just some techniques for dealing with this sort of stuff. I think that pretty much wraps up a lot of the stuff that I wanted to cover in this class. I hope that this was a good starting point for people who are completely new to HTML and CSS. And it's not something, knowing how to design websites that's a completely other topic in itself. And there are a lot of resources that you guys can go and look up to find more about it. What I wanted to do here was talk about the technical side. How do we actually go from a design that's already in somebody's head and make it so our browser renders it properly the way we want it to? If you are a web designer, understanding HTML CSS is paramount. And especially understanding the new CSS3 properties such as shadows and rounded corners and all the stuff that you used to require the designer to chop up a design in Photoshop and turn it into a bunch of little slices that are applied to elements, and then you had like 20 million elements and the world ended. You don't need to do that anymore for some of the most common properties. So it's important to understand the features and the limitations of CSS if you plan on being a web designer. So the last thing that I want to do, now that we've kind of gone through all the stuff I wanted to cover in this course, is let's make some icons. I just want to throw this in as something fun for people. This wasn't, I literally didn't even have this in the lesson plan until today. I was like, this class, I don't have a whole lot to say, so let's go ahead and toss something fun in. So let's do font awesome. Let's talk about it. One of the most common things that you will run into in CSS and web design is the need to have icons. And there are a lot of free open source icon packs available on the internet, but one that I found in particular that stands out is Font Awesome, for a variety of reasons. First of all, Font Awesome isn't actually technically an icon pack. Font Awesome is a font, which means that all these font icons that we're looking at are vector images that can be scaled to whatever size we want them to. So for example, if I click on Icon Gamepad, this is just a font, and I can make this as big or small as I want to. So I can go in here and I can say, I want the font size to be 50 pt. And I can sit here and I can make it bigger or smaller, depending on my needs, and it grows appropriately because it's all vector-based graphics. It also means that I can color it. So not only can we size everything from Font Awesome to whatever we want, we can also give them whatever color we want. Now, the one drawback, of course, is that you can only give a font a single color, so you can't have any multicolor icons. But that's typically fine. So that's an introduction to Font Awesome and an explanation of why it's awesome. A quick note about what you see right here. It says the iconic font designed for Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap is something that we'll be talking about soon. It's a CSS framework that allows us to very easily put together web pages quickly, and it gives us a lot of really nice little components to work with. In fact, if you're using BuzzNet right now, you'll see examples of some Bootstrap elements. Today we're not going to be talking about Bootstrap, but when it says the iconic font design for Bootstrap, it doesn't mean that Font Awesome only works on Bootstrap. Fortunately, we can drop it into whatever page we want. So let's go ahead and get it downloaded and set up. Now, if you download Font Awesome, you'll notice that it comes with 3 folders. We have CSS, Font, and Less. Again, Less is a CSS preprocessor, and something that we're not going to use. If we were using Less, we would want to use the Font Awesome Less package. But fortunately, they also distribute a style sheet that we can use. I'm going to be using the Font Awesome .css for now, so we can look at the source code of Font Awesome, but in production you would want to use the minified version of it. And a minified resource is a resource that's been stripped of all extraneous characters, such as comments and white space, just so that it's slightly smaller. Notice how right here the minified version is about 5 kilobytes smaller than the non-minified version. So to make Font Awesome work, all we need is the CSS and the font files. So I'm going to jump into my week 4 folder. I'm going to drag over Font Awesome and copy it in. Then I'm going to go into my font folder and drag over all of these guys. Actually, no. I'm going to create a subfolder called fonts. Whoops, fonts. And I'm going to drag in all my fonts into this. So again, these fonts are actually where the entire font or the entire icon set lives. You'll notice that if you just double click on it and preview it, you'll see that, wait a sec, this doesn't look like a bunch of icons. Well, that's because Font Awesome, it actually defines its icons in a character space that is beyond normal ASCII, so that screen readers don't blow up while they try to read your application out loud. So it looks like a normal font, but it actually isn't. It's packed with a bunch of awesome icons, no pun intended. Okay, so now that I have my fonts and my Font Awesome CSS, the first step I have to do is I have to go into my Font Awesome CSS and actually change where it's going to be pulling my font files from. You'll notice that up here at the top, it defines the URLs for all the fonts, and the rest of the page is mainly used for defining which icons mean which characters. So that's kind of how the source code is structured. I'm going to modify the source code slightly so that it will look in the folder I put my fonts in, which, if you recall, was just fonts/Font Awesome. So let me go ahead and make this font/blah blah blah. You guys understand what I'm doing here right now, right? I'm not like losing everybody already. Okay, so there we go. I've just changed the directory that my fonts live in. I could have put it in a folder that I didn't have to do this with, but I wanted to make it very clear to people that Font Awesome isn't magic. It needs to know where your fonts are located, and if you ever make a different version or a different directory structure than the default, you'll have to go in and modify that. So now that I've done that, I can go into my example2.html and I can add another link tag. So I'm going to say link href font awesome.css rel equals style sheet. Then I'm going to jump into my browser, hit F12, go to my network tab and hit refresh, and make sure that my Font Awesome did load. And you'll notice that it did. It didn't run into a 404 error, which means that I can now use it. So let's go ahead and replace my plus buttons and my X buttons with Font Awesome. So I'm going to, first of all, go to my plus icons. Instead of being plus, they're going to be I. Now, whenever you have an I tag, make sure that you don't self-close it. You need an opening I tag and a closing I tag, otherwise you will get very odd behavior. Now Font Awesome is all expressed as CSS classes that we can apply to I tags. So let's find the icon that I want for my plus. I don't really like that one. I'm just going to do Control F on plus. Okay, so we got a plus sign, Google plus sign, blah, blah, blah. Do we have an add symbol? No, we don't have an add symbol. So I'm going to go with the plus. I think that's going to be the most appropriate thing to do. So, do I want that one? I want the plus sign. So we see right here that all we have to do is say icon dash plus dash sign. So I'm going to say class equals icon plus sign. Then I'm going to take this I tag, copy it, and paste it into all of my other instances where the plus appears. And make sure I actually save my HTML file. Hit refresh, and we have our plus sign appearing. Now I don't like how it affected my padding. Let's go ahead and see how we can fix this. I guess what we could do is I could go ahead and give this smaller left and right padding. So maybe 8 pixels, no, 9 pixels. I'm going to go with 9 pixels. So I'm going to change my padding of my to-do container H1A. I'm going to change it to, so to-do container H1A, and change its padding to that. Next up, I want a rollover effect for my plus buttons. And it's really easy to do with Font Awesome. What I'm going to do is I am going to grab a color, or the current color of this, which actually no, is green. I already know it's green. And I'm going to swap them on hover over. So I'm going to say, if we hover over it, I want the background to be green and I want the color to be white. I do like that effect. Okay, I'm starting to get really annoyed with that border. Goodbye. That looks a lot nicer. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and do the same for my X's. So what I want is I want a minus sign. I don't really like that. Delete, remove. There. I like this one. Icon remove. So I'm just going to copy his name. I'm going to find every case where I have this X, and I'm going to replace the X with I class icon remove. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to copy it, I'm going to paste it into each one of the occurrences of this X. Now I'm going to come back to my application, hit refresh, and now we have a fancy little X there. Which again, I'm not a fan of how it's not a fan of, give me 1 second. I need to find the style. See, this is why style sheet organization is important. Where are you? You are right here? Yeah, I think so. Dot finish? Yeah, it's dot finish. So I'm going to go ahead and say get rid of his font weight bold. And that does nothing. So it doesn't matter. It just got a little bit wider than I wanted it to. Again, I could go through and alter his padding, but that's not important. What's important is that I just wanted to show off something that's really fun and really easy and gives you a lot of flexibility. Because remember, the individual icons can be made to be as big as you want. You can set their opacity. You can even give them text shadows if you want, and you can color them. One thing that I haven't talked about at all, which it looks like some people are now noticing, is I haven't really talked about images a whole lot. And that's going to have to be something that we'll play around with in a small workshop or in a shorter video. I want to discourage people from using images unless they need to for layout bits. Now, obviously, there are some cases where images are not only completely necessary, but entirely appropriate. For example, if I had a profile picture right here, I would want that to be an image. But when it comes to things like the actual layout of the page, be very careful with it and see if you can solve your problem using CSS rather than an image first. Remember, with CSS, we can do everything from rounded corners to drop shadows to text shadows, gradients, all sorts of fun stuff. So just be careful about it. With CSS, we can also use custom fonts. So if you think that you need your navigation buttons to be an image instead of text, that's very likely not the case, and could in fact be very detrimental to your application as far as maintainability and search engine visibility. Alrighty, so how's everyone doing? Are there any last questions about CSS that we need to go over today? Because I think we are just about getting to the point where we will be wrapping up. How does the browser know to download the font to the user? Well, that's a good question. We can prove that it's downloading it by looking at our network tab. Or, there we go. I had to hit Control F5 because the font was cached. We can see that the browser is downloading FontAwesome webfont.waf. It's coming from the CSS file. Because if I look at the FontAwesome CSS file, we'll see that up here it's saying font face, and it's giving us a URL to the font that it needs to download. So what this is basically doing is this syntax, we haven't really covered this syntax, but it's providing us with a new font face that we can use in our application, and it's specifying exactly where that font is. Now you'll notice that there are multiple versions of the same font in different formats. That's because different browsers understand different font formats. So it has to provide all of them. But once the browser notices that you are using a font face that hasn't been downloaded yet, it'll use the source attribute or the source property to find where that font is physically located. In this case, it's under the fonts folder under FontAwesome Web Font. And I think the one Chrome downloaded was the WAF. Yeah. And that one is specified right here. So that's what Chrome saw, and that's what Chrome downloaded. So that is a good point, I suppose, because remember that resources can be loaded within CSS. Things like background images or fonts or even other style sheets. It's important to realize that the URL for a resource loaded by CSS is not relative to the HTML file. It's relative to the CSS file, which means that if I were to go into my page and I'll make a folder called Styles, and I'm going to drop FontAwesome into it. Watch what happens. Well, first of all, it's going to break period because our link to our style sheet's now broken. If I could just come on. Let's open another browser window. Here we go. So you'll see that I moved my my CSS file. Now it obviously is not going to load, so all my fonts disappear, or all of my icons disappear. So let's fix that one first. So now my style sheet, my Font Awesome style sheet will load. But notice now how everything has that little couldn't find the character within the font icon. That's because it cannot locate my font. And you might be thinking, well, wait a sec. If I look at the CSS file, it's requesting it from fonts/fontawesome.webfont, which should be exactly where it is. If we look at Explorer, we'll see that it is underneath the font subdirectory. But we have to remember that all of the resources loaded by the style sheet is relative to where the style sheet is, not where the HTML document is. Which means that to fix this problem, I have to go into my fontawesome.css, which I need to close this one because I moved it. If I go into my fontawesome CSS, I actually now have to tell it where the font is located relative to the CSS file, not relative to where the HTML file is being served from. So now that I've fixed that, I can come over here and I can refresh, and now we get our fonts. If I hit Control F5, we'll see that it did load it from the appropriate location, which is 192.168.111 week 4/fonts/fontawesome. Does that make sense? All right. Well, somebody's asking me about my my style sheet, but I don't know exactly. Scroll through my code. Well, there's actually quite a bit of it here. If you're having specific troubles, just ask me after class and we can go through it. But I don't know exactly which part of the code you need to look at. Okay. So again, I think that wraps everything up. Again, we just left off with something a little fun to play around with. I really do like Font Awesome quite a bit. And yeah, so just a quick recap for this class. We started off with HTML and CSS, what they were, what web servers are, how HTTP requests resources. At least we briefly went over that. The week after that, we talked about CSS selectors, or how we are able to select specific elements out of our document to style. Last week, we talked about the box model and how we can do floating and positioning to make our elements appear where we want them to in the page. And then finally this week we wrapped up talking about how we can make dropdowns and how we can actually put together a responsive design that will work on desktops, laptops, netbooks, tablets, and phones. So I think that's about it, and I will see all you future people later.